Please pretend you're my dad, the little girl gasped, and the man with the Hell's Angel-style patch on his vest froze. It was a Tuesday that smelled of spilled gasoline and old coffee. Jake Reaper Morrison had been wiping rain off his handlebars when the scream cleaved the twilight. He turned toward the convenience store and saw her, 6 years old by the size of her shoes, hair damp as if she'd been crying in the rain, clutching a dented pink backpack so tight her knuckles were white. She darted past the automatic doors and into the fluorescent wash where Jake stood filling his tank, then stopped as if the air itself were a border she didn't want to cross. She looked at him the way a drowning person looks at a life ring. He didn't see the world as she did. He saw fences and scars and the weight of his own streetwise survival. But in that look, he heard something as old as any highway song, fear asking for shelter. He heard a child's voice ask for a small, enormous thing, a role, a protection, a lie that could buy seconds. "Please, pretend you're my dad," she said again, words thin and urgent. The plea landed between the pumps and the trash can like an accusation. Everyone else went quiet. A man at the slushing machine looked up and pretended not to notice. A teenager with earbuds slowed and watched. The man approaching them, ordinary in a gray coat and tidy shoes, smiled the wrong kind of smile. Jake had 1,000 reputations before his name, tattoos that braided his past into his skin, a cut and steady look that said he'd seen things the rest of the town kept out of sight. He also had hands that were big enough to stop a man without breaking him, and a habit of putting a body between trouble and the small and unarmed. He was not a father. He had never wanted to be, but he knew how to stand like one. The man in the gray coat stepped closer, voice lubricated by charm. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, reaching toward the child with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before. "You lost?" The child recoiled. Her lower lip quivered. She whispered, "He's my dad." It wasn't a question. It was an instruction, a lifeline thrown to a stranger. Jake's hand moved. He didn't plan it. He didn't think. He took the man's wrist in a palm-strong grip and twisted him off balance. And when the man's phone lit up in his pocket, a message preview flashed across the glass. "Arrive 8 p.m. One child. Blue backpack. Payment on arrival." Jake's stomach dropped. The line on the screen was small and clinical in the color of someone else's cruelty. It didn't belong in a gas station. It belonged to a different map of the city, a map that could be traced across back alleys and hotel lobbies, across chat groups and quick cash transactions. The phone vibrated again. Another notification. 2 more. Tonight. A row of emojis. A butcher's tally in digital form. He pushed that hand away gently, almost as if he were moving a sleeping thing. For the first time since he'd learned to read a room by the smell of diesel and fear, he felt something like rage and shame braid together. He looked at the child. "Lily." Her name came in a little stutter from the woman who had followed out, phone already to her ear, voice trembling as she said, "Mrs. Chen, she ran out. She said a man was—" Jake crouched until they were eye level. The girl didn't look down at him. "What's your name?" he asked, as if naming might anchor whatever storm had blown over this corner. "Lily," she whispered. "All right, kiddo," Jake said. His voice was rough and soft at the same time, like a road that had weathered many winters. "Lily, stay by me. Don't worry." That was the lie she asked him to tell. He would tell it. He put his jacket around her shoulders, as if it were the only coat in the world that mattered. The man in the gray coat stayed on his toes, watching like a caged animal calculating the space he had to move. Jake's fingers were still tight around the phone when he saw the second preview. Warehouse drop. Midnight. Bring cash. Keep it quiet. Something in him understood this as not a single predator, but as a system. A system was always worse than one man. A system had reach. A system had customers, schedules, logistics. A system could be shut down, or at least interrupted. He thought of every time he told someone on the street that he would take care of a problem, and then just watch them not take care of it. Tonight, he would not watch. If this moment hit you, tap like and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories that matter. He called Bulldog first. The number was stored under a name that had been earned through midnight runs and owed favors, and the kind of loyalty that wasn't sold at a pawn shop. Bulldog's voice was a gravelly machine that warmed into a human thing when he heard the urgency. "Jake?" Bulldog asked. "Get Ghost and Hammer. Tell him the old warehouse on Dock Road, 2 hours. Bring everything but the press, Jake said. He didn't say a word about the plea, about the child's tiny shoes, about the flashing lines of messages. He didn't have to. The men on the other end knew the language, the short sentences that implied whole worlds. You called it in? Bulldog asked. Jake looked at Lily as if the answer could be read in the curve of her shoulders. Not yet. He called Ghost on the second ring. Ghost answered wry and flat. You picked up a runaway Reaper? You've got to unlock the phone, Jake said, voice tight. There are messages. Ghost laughed like a man about to do something stupid and necessary. On my way. They arrived 2 at a time, the way wind comes at you, low and then all at once. The sound of their bikes ate the echo of the gas station's fluorescent hum and carved the air into safer and more dangerous pieces. They parked in a line like a wall and took in Lily with a glance that was all calculation and tenderness in one fold. Bulldog put a steady hand on Jake's shoulder like an old prayer. Hammer checked the exits. Ghost waited until he had the phone. The chat revealed a ledger of cruelty, small, clipped messages, times, code words, exchange points. The language was transactional, like someone taking inventory. Ghost scrolled with a thumb that moved so quick it was almost reverent. It's not just tonight, he said. Look at this. Names, codes, a list, locations. A name popped up that chilled Jake. Bluebird. It was a nickname they'd used in the club for a lost kid from years back. Not related, perhaps, but a reminder that networks could be linked like the stitches of a sweater. Ghost's face did not change much, but there was a storm in his eyes. The phone showed screenshots of payments, of passengers, of pickup locations. There were references to children by ages and a shorthand that made a hardcover ledger cold and paperless. Jake swallowed hard. His first thought was for Lily, and for every other small frame hidden in the pixels of a stranger's phone. His second thought was of the law, of the neat line between taking a life into your own hands and trusting a state to put the chains where they needed to be. He had seen police drive past places they did not want to stop. He had seen detectives close files to keep their jobs. But he'd also seen what happens when people take the law into their own hands. Reputations turned into punishments, mistakes amplified into tragedies. He would not pretend to be above that. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived in a car that smelled faintly of paperwork and coffee. Her uniform wasn't flawless, but it carried the quiet authority of someone who'd learned to bend no rules that mattered without knowing the consequences. She looked at Jake with a suspicion tempered by gratitude, 2 things she was practiced at holding at once. You called me? She said. No, Jake admitted, but it was on the phone. We found messages. She took the phone like a surgeon taking a scalpel. Her fingers moved with the kind of precision that comes from doing hard things that mean other people's lives. She read the messages and didn't flinch out loud. You shouldn't have touched the device, she said. Not a rebuke, but a fact. Jake's answer was quiet. I already messed up the crime scene. Detective Martinez didn't smile. You didn't break anything we can't fix. But if you had tried to build a case your way, it would have been a mess. We need warrants. We need a legal trail. We need to make sure every arrest counts in court. Ghost watched her like someone watching a chess player who also moved like a hunter. She can help. You know how these things spread. She looked at Lily, whose breathing had slowed because the emergency of being seen was over for now. Who's her mother? Detective Martinez asked. Mrs. Chin, a voice said. Mrs. Chin stood by the pump, phone clutched to her chest, cheeks raw from crying.
We were shopping. I left her for a second. I came back and she was gone. I tried to call and... Do you want us to put you somewhere safe? Detective Martinez asked. I want her back, Mrs. Chen said. The words were a compass needle. They pointed to the only true objective. Jake stepped back enough to let the trained officer take command. He felt like someone who had been holding a live wire and now watched someone else threaded safely. The moral line had a handhold, and there was comfort in it. There were meetings in the back of the gas station's small diner booth, where the vinyl seats hummed under their weight. Detective Martinez outlined the legal path. Warrants, leads, the need to trace IP addresses and transaction records tied to the numbers they'd found. Jake listened and felt the weight of time. The messages promised a warehouse drop in 2 hours. That was not enough for a clean warrant. It was a future crime. It was an open invitation to monsters. But it was also a chance to stop them before they struck again. They negotiated the plan like people building a fragile bridge over a river that could wash them all away. Bulldog and Ghost promised to be a believable presence at the drop, to occupy the shadows and let the law step in like a hammer. Detective Martinez agreed to run the raid with her team if the bikers provided the cover the police needed to approach without spooking the traffickers. It was an off-the-record handshake wrapped in a web of legal risk. The bikers would not storm in guns blazing. The police would make arrests. They would act in concert. Jake felt the tug of his old code, that contests of honor were settled in the open, that a brotherhood meant you put your life on the line for the other man. He also felt something else, the urgent, dangerous compassion that had made him stop a man reaching for a child in a gas station. He promised himself that tonight would be a clean, surgical cut at a system. He promised Mrs. Chen in the way men like him sometimes promise, with a look that said he would be there. They rode out 2 hours later, 5 Harleys cutting through the city's veins, headlights like knives. The night folded over them like cloth. The warehouse on Dock Road sat where industrial things went to die. Broken windows, rusted containers, a rolling door that had seen better days. The graffiti smelled of spent ideas and anger. Trash scattered like confetti left after a bad party. It should have felt cinematic, a place where good men clad in leather would charge in and everything would spade towards justice. Instead, it felt like stepping into an animal's lair. Bulldog and Ghost parked in plain view. They lit cigarettes and walked as if they were men looking for a good fight, the exact kind of people the traffickers would want to see. Hardened faces, loud laughter, an aura of danger. That aura was the bait. Jake wore his patch like armor, a Hell's Angel-style emblem sewn on a vest that had seen many winters.
The patch was not a manifesto. It was a signpost to a life of choices and the prejudices those choices drew. Tonight, it was a tool. In the shadows, Detective Martinez's team moved in precise, whispering lines. They had warrants in their hands. They had legal authority. The bikers had presence. The traffickers had overconfidence and a lack of imagination about how much people could be willing to step into harm's way for a child they'd never met. Jake walked into the warehouse as if into a dream of wrongness. The air hung heavy with stale odors, oil, sweat, the metallic breath of industrial cold. Lights flickered like a nervous pulse. Then there were children, small bodies on pallets, blankets half thrown, wide eyes ringing with the kind of shock born of betrayal and long waiting. They were quiet as birds just after a storm, listening for a sound of safety and not finding it at first. The traffickers were ordinary men in ordinary sweatshirts who thought they had turned the world into numbers. Their surprise made them reckless, a first clumsy reaction that Detective Martinez had trained for. Her team breached and shouted commands, numbers absorbed into the air like a new law. The bikers moved to seal exits, to clear alleyways of possible reinforcements. There were crashes and a few flailed attempts at resistance. No one got to play vigilante heroics. Jake felt the pulse of legality lead the way, and that steadied his hands. He found a boy no older than 8 trembling behind a stack of boxes, a girl with mud under her fingernails, and that look of someone who'd already had to fold herself smaller to survive. Lily sat on an overturned crate, hugging her knees. When Jake reached her, she looked up as if he'd been sent personally by some kinder fate. "You're not bad, are you?" a small voice asked him, suspicious and hopeful at once. Jake felt the old jokes about his leather and his road dust melt into something honest. He knelt down to be at her level, and this time he didn't pretend. "I'm not bad," he said. "I'm here to keep you safe." Someone nearby, one of the detectives or a social worker, began to call out names into a phone. Medical teams were arriving, red lights painting the broken glass like bruises. Children were wrapped in blankets. One by one, the small frames began to let the shape of relief settle in. It was not instant. Shock was a heavy thing that needed time and professional hands to help untangle. That night, however, safety took the shape of people who would not leave until paperwork did what courage had only started to do. Detective Martinez worked through the arrests with a calm that had learned to mask urgency. Warrants were read, hands were cuffed, names would be processed and charges filed. The bikers stood near the exits, their hands empty, their faces set in the expression of people who had done something necessary and ugly and important. Jake watched as the children were led to vans, as pediatric nurses checked for injuries that were not always visible, as social workers sat with trembling little ones and explained, as delicately as anyone could, that they were safe. Among the rescued was a boy who asked, in a voice trying to hold on to defiance, "Are you one of the bad guys?" He pointed at Jake's patch, like a question hurled at the sky. Jake's answer was as gentle as a hand on a shoulder. "Not tonight," he said, and the boy snorted a laugh that tasted like new trust. It was a small thing. It was everything. Mrs. Chen fell apart when she saw Lily. The reunion had the soft, gravitational force of a world putting itself back in orbit. Lily ran into her mother's arms and buried her face. The adult cries that followed were less cinematic and more real. Thank yous, apologies, the sound of a woman trying to promise she would never let a moment like that slip again. Mrs. Chen looked at Jake with salt streaking down her face. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Her voice was rough, threaded with fatigue and fresh grief. Jake shrugged like a man whose ledger accounted for 1,000 small debts. "You don't have to," he said. "Just get her to someone who knows how to fix a scared mind. Don't trust me for that." Detective Martinez walked over, eyes shadowed under the wear of the night. "We traced half the chain from the devices here," she said. "This goes beyond this warehouse. We have buyers, handlers, runners. We'll need more warrants. We'll need time. People will try to make this go away. But tonight, you stopped a meeting. That helps." There were arrests that night. Some men would be taken into custody on the spot. Others would be traced and donned into longer investigations across county lines. Detective Martinez turned over the evidence the bikers had found. She took statements. She filed every small detail into a lawful process that could turn the raw, urgent courage of the night into a courtroom. Back in the dim light of their clubhouse, men who had always talked in hard truths sat in a circle that felt less like a council and more like a confessional. The clubhouse smelled of old leather and brewing coffee, photo frames smudged with years on the walls. Jake had been coming here since his 20s. The walls had seen grief and laughter and the piecemeal reparations men like them made to keep from dissolving. Tonight, the walls heard a new kind of conversation. Bulldog started it. "We did good," he said, and the room hummed in agreement. But Ghost, who had read messages and kept his face a mask, asked the harder question. At what cost? He looked at Jake and then at the rest. "We could have gone in guns blazing. We could have fucked it all up for the kids and for the cases. We didn't. But what if next time we don't get a Detective Martinez on the other side? What if next time it's 5 minutes too late?" Hammer tapped his pipe against his knee.
"Then we keep doing what we did," he said simply. "We find ways to make sure the law is in play. We know the streets. We feed the law lines. That's not vigilante shit. That's partnership." The debate shaped a new code. It wasn't written on paper at first. It was hammered out in tone and agreement and the kind of look that passes between men who measure their lives in deeds. They agreed on a simple rule. If they find it, call it in. If they can provide evidence, hand it cleanly to the detectives. If they must act first to preserve life, they do it with the express intent of handing over the cleanest possible scene to law enforcement. It was a moral middle ground, not safe, not pure, but honest. They didn't pretend that their pasts vanished. They didn't imagine their patches would be a cure-all. They did, however, decide to use the network they'd built for protection rather than pretense of power. They would start a hotline. The idea was practical and clumsy and would require paperwork and cooperation with child services. They would use their trust on the street to shepherd tips to the police, to be the ears on corners where many felt too afraid to speak. They would help fund a safe space for kids who needed somewhere to sleep that wasn't a police station or a hospital waiting room. Over the next months, the case unfolded like the slow opening of a bad bloom. Courtrooms began to populate with suspects, and the legal machine groaned and turned. Some arrests stuck. Some perpetrators were harder to catch. Detective Martinez worked long hours, her phone a lantern that burned through midnight. She trusted the bikers more for this one reason. They had not sought glory. They had sought children. There were complications. Not every tip led to a raid. Not every arrest led to justice. Laws were messy. Evidence had to be clean. Motives had to be irrefutable. Judges required more than hearts. Jake learned to feel the ache of patience. He learned that some fights were not won on a single night of roaring engines and shining chrome. They were won in courtrooms and in the slow bureaucracy of protective services and in the tiny daily work of restoring a child's sense of safety. Lily's family worked with therapists provided by the social services Jake helped fund. She attended sessions with women who taught her how to name emotions, how to trust a voice, how to sleep without dreams that made her flinch awake. Mrs. Chen volunteered at the fledgling community center because she wanted to be part of the scaffolding that would hold other children safe. The center sign was hand-painted and crooked in a way that made it feel human. Inside it, there were toys and counselors and the smell of hot cocoa sometimes, small things that meant the world. Word spread.
Neighbors who had known the club as a specter on the edge of town began to see them as something else, people who could be called when the anonymous got too close. There were critics.
There were old stories of bikers who had chosen roads that hurt people. The club never pretended to clean their pasts. They simply leaned into new actions that could tilt the ledger. There were consequences, too. Some members left, unable to reconcile the new code with the old ways. Others embraced it and started training in how to spot signs, how to pass information in ways that did not compromise investigations, how to be a witness without becoming a judge. Jake found his nights fuller and his sleep thinner. He took long rides alone where the only company was an engine and the skyline. He thought of the little hand that had slipped into his like a promise. He thought of the child's voice calling him father in that suspended hour, and how that call had rerouted him. There were other rescues after the warehouse. Not all were cinematic. One night, a mother named Rebecca Torres called the hotline in a voice that told of a boy named Tyler who had slipped away into the city, the way some things slip between fingers. The bikers sent 2 members to shadow possible hangouts, while Detective Martinez arranged for an approach. The boy was found in a motel parking lot at dawn, frightened but alive. There were no dramatic arrests that time, just a quiet hand on a shoulder, and a reminder that persistent presence often works better than fireworks. The community center grew into something that resembled hope and bureaucracy in equal parts. They had counselors who understood trauma, lawyers who offered pro bono help, and volunteers who taught kids carpentry and drawing and how to ride a bike without falling. There were meetings with local police to keep protocols tight and honest. It was imperfect, as anything knitted together out of hard pasts and shaky resources will be, but it was alive. Years later, in the sunlight that fell like forgiveness, Lily came to the center on a day that surprised everyone by being ordinary. She'd grown taller. The roundness of early childhood had given way to 10-year-old leanness. Her hair braided now in a way that looked practiced. Jake sat on a bench outside, elbows on his knees, listening to teenagers argue about music. He wasn't doing anything in particular, a kind of watchfulness he had learned to practice. She ran up to him, and he braced for the smallness that once had made him big. She flung herself at him and hugged him with the uncomplicated ferocity of someone who had once been afraid and now felt something secure. "You pretended," she said into his vest, like a report card and a prayer. Jake's throat tightened. "I did," he said. "I did pretend." She pulled back, studied his face as if confirming a hypothesis that had become true. "You were like a dad," she said, and the words settled in him like a new coat. In the clubhouse that night, they pinned a photograph on the wall, grainy and imperfect, of the bikers guiding a line of rescued children from the warehouse vans. It was not a trophy, it was a reminder. Underneath the picture, someone had written, in shaky marker, a line that smelled of private vow. "We do not pretend to be saints. We do what we can." Jake sometimes thought about whether what they'd done had changed him for good, or simply nudged him into another pattern of duty. He'd been an outlaw by reputation, and a protector by circumstance. The lines had blurred. He found himself answering calls in the small hours, not because the past dictated it, but because something within him had softened enough to make action feel like necessary work. He didn't crave headlines. He cringed at anything that turned pain into spectacle. He craved the future in which small hands could play without asking someone to lie. Detective Martinez and he kept an uneasy friendship. It was not the easy or cozy kind. It was the kind that depended on truth and could not be bought with gestures. She respected the biker's grit and feared their flashpoints. He respected the law's patient grind and feared its slowness. They argued about strategy and policy and held each other's mistakes like fragile objects. Sometimes they'd sit on the station steps at dawn and drink terrible coffee, and in those moments there was a mutual recognition that they were on different sides of a long, necessary bridge. The ripple effects continued. The hotline collected tips. The club's presence made certain corners safer. The court cases moved like glaciers. Some defendants were convicted, others pleaded out, and some cases dissolved under the strain of imperfect evidence. None of that wiped clean the nights these kids had spent in the dark. None of that erased the need for therapy and patience and the slow work of relearning trust. But it did mean that one network had been compromised and others disrupted. It meant Lily lived in a world where she could be loud and small without fear. Years later, as Jake watched children using the center's playground, he thought of the first time Lily had said the words that careened through his life.
he thought of the small, trembling plea that had asked him to pretend. He thought about the cost of pretending and the price of truth. He realized that the invitation had been bigger than a single night's decision. It had been a turning point. He had ridden roads that avoided being seen, that kept him as a myth to justify solitude. But Lily had looked at him and asked for more than a myth. She had asked for a substitute father for a moment, a role that required him to stand open and steady and protective. That small lie had become a real thing because he turned it into an action that protected many. On the wall of the community center, a banner read, in letters a child might have painted, "We keep watch." It was not an oath of land ownership or a claim to righteousness. It was a promise.
Jake looked at it and saw not a patch, but a clearing, a space where people could be unsafe and then safe again, where strangers could be handed over to care, where the law and unlikely allies could meet. As Lily bounded past him later that afternoon, she shouted without looking back, "Thanks, Reaper!" Her laugh was a bell. It wasn't an absolution of his past, nor a coronation. It was a human sound, bright and alive. He watched her go and felt the strange, stilling pride that sometimes settles in a man's chest when he realizes that his small act had set off a chain that saved people. He thought of the night at the gas station, the metallic taste of worry, the phone's display like a map of evil. He thought of Detective Martinez's voice, firm as the law, and Ghost's quick hands. He thought of Bulldog, of Hammer, of every man in a patch who chose to be something more than a stereotype. "Please pretend you're my dad," Lily had said, then and as if echoing for other children who would one day need help. The plea had been a seed. It had not blossomed into any mythic redemption. It had become instead practical redemption. Phone calls, evidence, warrants, therapy, a center that gave children the chance to be messy and small and safe. Jake did not think of heroism. He thought of duty, which sometimes looks like answering a child's call by holding them close and then making sure arms of law and health and community took over. In the quiet of late evening, when the bikes were parked and the clubhouse lights were dim, he ran his hand over the patch on his vest. It was a small thing. It was a heavy thing. And in the center's window across the street, he saw his shadow fall long and true over children playing. Years after the gas station, when Lily hugged him tight in the sunlight and called him by a name that meant something tender, Jake finally understood how a single plea, softly spoken and terrified, could reroute a life. He wasn't a father by law or by blood. He wasn't even sure he deserved the title. But in that moment he felt the full weight of what he'd promised, and it steadied him. He looked down at Lily and said, quietly, "I tried. I will try again." The plea that started it all floated back in his memory like a refrain. "Please pretend you're my dad." He had pretended then. He had become something truer over time, not by hiding behind a patch, but by standing in the light, messy and human. He had been shocked into action and found himself forever altered by it. If this story moved you, share it. Awareness helps protect kids. Subscribe for more real-life rescue stories.